Sometimes the very people who judge us the harshest are hiding the darkest secrets. We all know what it's like to feel like an outsider, watching from the edges, while others seem to belong so easily. Grace Hartwell chose the mountains over the town of Cedar Falls 15 years ago, after losing everything that mattered. The townspeople called her strange, a hermit who talked to animals more than people. But when her injured donkey leads her through a snowstorm to an old cabin, Grace finds something that changes everything. Hidden inside are papers and photographs that reveal a terrible truth about the town's most respected families. The same people who whispered about her are the ones with blood on their hands. Now Grace must decide whether to stay silent or expose the lies that built their perfect little community. What would you do if you discovered your neighbor's darkest secret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blizzard had come down like a curtain, thick and unforgiving, turning the familiar mountain paths into a maze of white. Grace Hartwell pulled her wool coat tighter as she followed Samson through the snow, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The old donkey limped badly, favoring his left front leg, but he moved with stubborn determination towards something only he seemed to understand. "Where are you taking us, old friend?" Grace murmured, her voice carried away by the wind. At 62, she had learned to trust Samson's instincts. In the 15 years they'd shared this mountain, he had never led her astray. The storm had caught them during their evening walk along the ridge. Grace preferred these twilight wanderings, when the world grew quiet and the ghosts of her past felt less insistent. She had been checking the fence line when Samson suddenly went lame, stepping wrong on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. Now, instead of heading home to their warm barn, he was leading her deeper into the wilderness. Grace's farm sat 3 miles above Cedar Falls, a modest spread of 40 acres that had belonged to her family for generations. She kept a few chickens, a vegetable garden that flourished in the short mountain summers, and Samson. It was a simple life, deliberately so. The kind of life that let a person think, remember, and slowly heal from wounds that might never fully close. She hadn't always been a hermit. 15 years ago, Grace Hartwell had been Mrs. Grace Coleman, a beloved third-grade teacher at Cedar Falls Elementary. She'd had a husband who made her laugh every morning over coffee, and a daughter whose bright curiosity reminded Grace why she'd chosen teaching in the first place. Sarah had been 8, with pigtails that never stayed neat, and a gap-toothed smile that could light up a room. The accident had taken them both on a rainy October evening. David had been driving home from parent-teacher conferences when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact killed him instantly. Sarah had lived long enough for Grace to hold her hand in the hospital, long enough to whisper "I love you" one last time before the machines stopped beeping. Grace stopped walking, steadying herself against a pine tree as the memory washed over her. Even after all these years, the grief could still knock the breath from her lungs. She closed her eyes, letting the cold air sting her cheeks until the present moment returned. Samson had paused too, his large brown eyes watching her with patient understanding. He'd been David's idea, purchased from a farm outside of town when Sarah had begged for a pet. "A donkey will teach her responsibility," David had said, grinning as 8-year-old Sarah threw her arms around Samson's neck. "And he'll live long enough to be her friend through high school." David had been right about the friendship, wrong about everything else. After the funeral, Grace had tried to return to her classroom, to the familiar rhythm of lesson plans and recess duty. But the sight of 8-year-olds with gap-toothed smiles was unbearable. The well-meaning sympathy of her colleagues felt suffocating. The town's collective grief, mixed with their relief that tragedy had passed them by, created a weight she couldn't carry. So she'd retreated. Sold the house in town, used the life insurance money to buy back the family farm from her cousin, and disappeared into the mountains with only Samson for company. The townspeople had understood at first. Grief needed space, they said. Time would heal the wounds. But time had stretched into years, and Grace's isolation had transformed from tragedy to eccentricity in their eyes. She made brief trips to town for supplies, nodding politely to former colleagues and neighbors who no longer knew how to speak to her. They whispered about the mountain woman who talked to her donkey, who had chosen animals over people, who had let grief turn her strange. Grace didn't correct their assumptions. It was easier to be thought odd than to explain that she hadn't abandoned people. She had simply learned to live with ghosts. Up here, surrounded by the vast silence of the mountains, David's laughter still echoed in the wind. Sarah's voice called from the meadow, where they used to pick wildflowers. The dead felt closer than the living, and that was how Grace preferred it. Samson snorted and shook the snow from his mane, bringing her attention back to their current predicament. The donkey had started moving again, following what looked like an old logging road that switched back through the pines. Grace had explored these mountains for 15 years, but this path felt unfamiliar. The wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across their vision. Grace's fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and she could feel ice forming in her eyelashes. They needed shelter soon, or this evening walk would become something more dangerous. As if he'd heard her thoughts, Samson increased his pace despite his limp. Through the swirling snow, Grace caught sight of something dark against the white, angular shapes that suggested human construction rather than natural formation. A cabin emerged from the storm, like something from a fairy tale. It was small, but well built, with a steep roof designed to shed snow and a stone chimney from which a thin trail of smoke was rising. Warm yellow light glowed in the windows, and the snow on the porch had been recently swept. Grace stopped short. In 15 years of wandering these mountains, she had never seen this cabin. More puzzling still, someone was clearly living here. The smoke from the chimney was fresh, the windows clean, the path to the door worn but maintained. Samson walked straight to the front porch, as if he'd been here many times before. He stood by the door and looked back at Grace expectantly, snow collecting on his back. "I don't think we should," Grace began, but a gust of wind nearly knocked her sideways. The temperature was dropping fast, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford in these conditions. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch and knocked on the wooden door. No answer. She tried again, louder this time, calling out a greeting. Still nothing. The door was unlocked. Grace hesitated with her hand on the latch. Breaking into someone's home went against everything she'd been taught. But Samson's labored breathing reminded her that they both needed warmth. She would leave money for any food they used, and a note explaining the emergency. The interior of the cabin was blissfully warm. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, recently fed but burning low. The single room was simply furnished. A bed with a patchwork quilt, a small kitchen table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with books and mason jars. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was something unsettling about the space that Grace couldn't quite identify. It felt like it had been waiting for her. She shook off the foolish thought and helped Samson through the door. The donkey settled near the fireplace with a grateful sigh, and Grace added wood to the fire. As the flames grew brighter, she got her first good look at the cabin's details. The books on the shelves were an eclectic mix: poetry, philosophy, natural history, and what looked like several journals with handwritten labels. The kitchen area held the basics: a few dishes, some canned goods, a coffee pot that looked decades old. But it was the far wall that made Grace's breath catch. Photographs, dozens of them, some framed, others tacked directly to the wood. Most were black and white, spanning what looked like several decades. Grace moved closer, studying the faces in the images. One photograph, larger than the rest and carefully framed, dominated the center of the display. It showed 4 people standing in front of what Grace recognized as the Cedar Falls courthouse. 2 men in sheriff's uniforms flanked 2 women, all of them smiling at the camera. The photo had the slightly faded quality of images from the 1980s or early 1990s. Grace lifted the frame with trembling hands. One of the uniformed men was unmistakably her father, Sheriff Tom Hartwell, looking young and proud in his pressed uniform. But it was the woman standing next to him that made Grace's world shift on its axis. The woman had Grace's own dark hair and strong jawline, but her eyes held a warmth and vitality that Grace hadn't seen in her own reflection for 15 years. More disturbing still, the woman looked familiar in a way that reached deeper than memory. Grace turned the frame over. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written, "Tom, Martha, Deputy Cross and Lily, Cedar Falls Annual Picnic, 1993. Martha. Grace stared at the name, feeling something stir in the depths of her memory like a fish moving in dark water. Her father had never mentioned anyone named Martha, but looking at this photograph, at the easy familiarity between her father and this unknown woman, Grace realized there were gaps in her family history that she'd never thought to question. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows and sending snow under the door. Grace carefully placed the photograph back on its hook and moved to check on Samson. The donkey was resting comfortably, his breathing easier in the warm air. As she settled into one of the chairs to wait out the storm, Grace's eyes kept returning to the wall of photographs. There were images of Cedar Falls from decades past, showing the town when it was smaller, less polished. She recognized some of the buildings, but many of the faces were strangers. One thing was clear, though. Whoever lived in this cabin had deep connections to Cedar Falls and to her father. The question was why Grace had never heard of this place, and why Samson had led her here with such determination. She found a leather journal on the bookshelf, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. The first page bore an inscription in the same handwriting as the photograph, "Property of Sheriff Tom Hartwell, Daily Notes and Observations." Grace's heart stopped. This was her father's journal, but she'd never seen it before. After his death from a heart attack 10 years ago, she and her mother had gone through all his belongings. There had been no mention of a cabin, no reference to anyone named Martha. She opened the journal to a random page and began to read her father's familiar handwriting. What she found there would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her town, and herself. Grace's hands trembled as she read her father's words by the flickering firelight. The journal entries were dated from the months before his death, and his normally steady handwriting showed signs of stress, hurried strokes, words crossed out and rewritten. March 15th, met with Martha again today. She's getting closer to something and it scares me. The land deals around Pinecrest Valley don't add up. Too many families selling for prices below market value, too many moving away immediately after. When I asked Mayor Cross about the discrepancies, he got defensive, told me to focus on keeping the peace, not stirring up trouble. Grace flipped to another entry, her father's words painting a picture of growing concern and isolation. March 22nd, Martha found another family willing to talk. The Hendersons said they were visited by men who made it clear that refusing to sell wasn't really an option. They were scared, Tom, really scared. But when I tried to follow up officially, all the paperwork had disappeared from the county clerk's office. Someone doesn't want these sales investigated. The wind howled outside, but Grace was completely absorbed in her father's documentation of what appeared to be a systematic pattern of intimidation and fraud. Page after page detailed suspicious land acquisitions, families who left town suddenly, and questions that were met with increasingly hostile responses from local officials. April 3rd, I found the connection. The Pinecrest Valley properties are all being purchased through shell companies that trace back to the founding families, the Crosses, the Whitakers, the Brennans. They're using intimidation to force sales at below-market prices, then developing the land at enormous profit. But it's worse than just fraud. Martha thinks some of the families who refused to sell might have met with accidents. Grace set the journal down, her heart racing. Her father had been investigating a conspiracy involving some of Cedar Falls' most respected families. But why had he never told her about it? And who was this Martha, who seemed to be his partner in the investigation? She forced herself to stand and explore the cabin more thoroughly. Behind the bed, she found a small desk with drawers that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. The wood was swollen with moisture, and it took some effort to pull the first drawer free. Inside, wrapped in an oiled cloth, was a deputy's badge. Not just any badge, her father's original deputy badge from before he became sheriff. Grace recognized it from old photographs, the same star-shaped shield he'd worn when she was a child. But what was it doing here, hidden away like a secret? The second drawer contained manila folders, marked with stamps reading "Confidential and Active." Investigation. Grace's breath caught as she opened the first folder and found herself looking at missing persons reports. Dating back 30 years, the files were meticulously organized, with photographs paper-clipped to detailed reports. Young families, elderly couples, single adults, all people who had vanished from Cedar Falls and the surrounding area over the past 3 decades. Grace recognized none of the names, but the pattern was unmistakable. Many of the missing persons had owned property in areas that were now valuable developments. One file was thicker than the rest, marked with red ink. Martha Sinclair, Priority Investigation. Grace opened it with growing dread. The photograph showed the same woman from the framed picture on the wall. But this was clearly a formal portrait, the kind used for driver's licenses or employee identification. Martha Sinclair had been 34 when she disappeared, leaving behind a successful accounting practice and a small daughter. Grace read the report with mounting horror. Martha had been investigating discrepancies in the town's land. Acquisition records when she failed to return home one evening in April 1994. Her car was found 3 days later at the bottom of Miller's Gorge, but her body was never recovered. The official cause of death was ruled accidental, a tragic case of someone driving too fast on a dangerous mountain road. But her father's handwritten notes told a different story. Martha had been receiving threatening phone calls in the weeks before her disappearance. She told friends she was afraid for her life and had hidden evidence somewhere safe. Most damning of all, Martha's car showed signs of being forced off the road, paint scrapes that didn't match the accident, scene and damage patterns consistent with being rammed by another vehicle. Grace found herself staring at Martha's photograph, that familiar face that had stirred something deep in her memory. There was something about the woman's eyes, a warmth and intelligence that seemed to reach across the decades. The final item in Martha's file made Grace's blood run cold. It was a birth certificate for Martha's daughter, a little girl who had been placed in foster care after her mother's death. The child's name was listed as Grace Sinclair, born in Cedar Falls, on the same date as Grace's own birthday. Grace dropped the file, papers scattering across the cabin floor. Her mind reeled as she tried to process what she was seeing. The birth certificate had to be a coincidence. People shared birthdays all the time, but the nagging sense of familiarity when she looked at Martha's photograph suddenly made terrible sense. She scrambled to gather the scattered papers, her hands shaking as she searched for more information about Martha's daughter. The file contained a handwritten note from her father, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Grace must never know the truth until she's ready. Martha died protecting her daughter, and we've kept that protection in place all these years. But if something happens to me, if they come for our family next, Grace will need to know who she really is and what Martha died trying to expose. The evidence is all here, hidden where only Grace would think to look. Zamson will show her the way when the time is right. Grace sank into the chair, the pieces of her life rearranging themselves into a pattern she'd never suspected. The father she'd adored, the man who had raised her with such fierce protection, had been keeping the most fundamental truth of her existence from her. She wasn't Grace Hartwell by birth. She was Grace Sinclair, the daughter of a woman who had been murdered for getting too close to the truth about Cedar Falls' founding families. The memories came flooding back then, fragments of early childhood that had always seemed like dreams. A woman with dark hair singing lullabies in a voice that wasn't her mother's, moving from one house to another when she was very young. Her parents' strange reluctance to talk about her early years, always changing the subject when she asked about baby pictures or family stories. Tom and Ellen Hartwell had adopted her after Martha's death, giving her their name and their love while keeping her true history locked away. They'd raised her in Cedar Falls, right under the noses of the people who had killed her birth mother, protecting her through the simple expedient of hiding her in plain sight. Samson snorted from his place by the fire, and Grace looked at him with new understanding. Her father's note had said Samson would show her the way when the time was right. The old donkey hadn't led her to this cabin by accident. Somehow he had known it was time for her to learn the truth. Grace picked up her father's journal again, this time looking for references to her adoption. She found them scattered throughout the entries from 1994, written in a careful code that took her several minutes to decipher. April 20th. The little sparrow is safe with us now. Ellen cried when we brought her home, not from sadness, but from fierce love. She says Grace has Martha's eyes, but Tom's stubborn chin. We'll protect her the way we couldn't protect her mother. April 25th. Destroyed all the official records linking Grace to Martha. As far as anyone knows, she's been our daughter from birth. It's the only way to keep her safe from the people who killed Martha. They can never know Martha had a daughter, or that the daughter might one day seek justice. Grace closed the journal and looked around the cabin with new eyes. This had been Martha's place, her sanctuary, where she'd gathered evidence of the conspiracy that had ultimately cost her life. For nearly 30 years, it had been maintained in secret, waiting for the day when Martha's daughter would be ready to finish what her mother had started. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, but Grace made no move to leave. She had decades of truth to absorb, and for the first time in 15 years, her grief over losing David and Sarah felt manageable compared to the magnitude of what she'd discovered about her origins. She was the daughter of a murdered woman, raised by the one honest lawman who had tried to protect both mother and child. The people responsible for Martha's death were still alive, still powerful, still profiting from their crimes. And somehow, Grace was the only person left who could bring them to justice. The question was whether she had the courage to finish what Martha Sinclair had died trying to accomplish. Grace spent the night in Martha's cabin, unable to sleep, as she pored over file after file of evidence her birth mother had compiled. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the mountains draped in pristine white. Samson seemed fully recovered from his limp, but when Grace gathered her things to leave, the donkey planted his feet and refused to move toward the door. "We can't stay here forever, old friend," Grace said softly. But even as she spoke the words, she understood his reluctance. This cabin held the truth she'd been searching for her entire life without even knowing it. She compromised by hiding the most damning evidence in her coat pockets before coaxing Samson outside. The walk back to her farm gave her time to think, to process the earth-shattering revelations of the previous night. Every step through the snow felt like walking between two different lives. The one she'd lived as Grace Hartwell, and the one she should have lived as Grace Sinclair. Her farmhouse looked different when they arrived, smaller somehow, as if learning her true history had changed the very scale of her world. Grace went through the motions of her morning routine, feeding the chickens, checking the water pipes, making coffee, but her mind was entirely focused on the manila folder she'd hidden in her bedroom. The folder contained a hand-drawn map that had been tucked behind Martha's desk. It showed the Pinecrest Valley area with property lines carefully marked in different colors. Red ink indicated properties that had been acquired through the suspicious forced sales. Blue showed the current developments that had been built on that land. Green marked properties that had resisted the pressure to sell. Grace spread the map across her kitchen table and studied it with the methodical attention she'd once given to lesson planning. The pattern was clear and damning. Over the course of 2 decades, the founding families of Cedar Falls had systematically acquired thousands of acres of prime real estate through intimidation, fraud, and what appeared to be murder. The Pinecrest Valley Golf Course sat on land that had belonged to 3 different farm families, all of whom had mysteriously decided to sell. Within a 6-month period in 1995, the exclusive Brennan Heights subdivision occupied former grazing land that had been in the Henderson family for 4 generations. until old Jim Henderson had his heart attack while walking his property line in 1997. But it was the green marks that made Grace's blood run cold. Her own family's property was outlined in green, with a note in Martha's handwriting, Hartwell Farm, targeted for acquisition 1994, protected by sheriff's position. Revisit after Tom's retirement. Grace realized with growing horror that her adoptive father's death might not have been the natural heart attack everyone believed. The timing was too convenient. Tom Hartwell had died just 2 months after announcing his intention to retire from the sheriff's department. His replacement, Sheriff Daniel Cross, was the son of Mayor Benjamin Cross and Deputy Cross from the photograph. The conspiracy wasn't just about land. It was about power, generational wealth, and a system of corruption that had infected every level of Cedar Falls government. Martha had stumbled onto something that threatened the very foundation of the town's power structure, and they had killed her for it. Grace found herself thinking about her own family's tragedy 15 years ago. The drunk driver who had killed David and Sarah had been a drifter, someone with no connections to Cedar Falls. But David had been asking questions about the town's budget in the months before his death, pushing for greater transparency in how public funds were being spent. As a member of the school board, he'd had access to financial records that might have revealed the same patterns Martha had discovered. The possibility that her husband and daughter had been murdered sent Grace to her knees on the kitchen floor. For 15 years, she'd carried the guilt of survival, wondering why she'd been spared when they were taken. The cruel randomness of their deaths had been the foundation of her grief. But if their deaths hadn't been random, if they'd been targeted because David was getting too close to the truth, Grace forced herself to stand, to push the paralyzing thoughts aside. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. If she was right about the conspiracy, if the same people who had killed Martha were still in power, then she was in danger simply by existing. As Martha's daughter, she represented a threat they thought they'd eliminated decades ago. She needed allies, but who could she trust in a town where corruption reached into every institution? The sheriff was part of the conspiracy. The mayor was Benjamin Cross, whose family had been involved since the beginning. Even the judges who would hear any case she might bring were likely compromised. Grace remembered Dr. Samuel Reed, the elderly physician who had delivered most of Cedar Falls' children over the past 40 years. He'd been her father's closest friend, a quiet man with kind eyes who had comforted Grace after Tom's funeral. If anyone might know the truth about her father's investigation, it would be Dr. Reed, but approaching him would require careful planning. Grace had learned to be invisible in Cedar Falls, slipping in and out of town for supplies without drawing attention. But now she realized that her hermit reputation might actually be an advantage. No one expected the strange mountain woman to be investigating decades-old crimes. She spent the afternoon studying Martha's files, memorizing names and dates, understanding the scope of the conspiracy. The Pinecrest Valley developments were just the beginning. Martha had traced similar patterns throughout the county, each wave of forced sales followed by profitable developments owned by shell companies that led back to the same families. The amount of money involved was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested the conspiracy had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits over 3 decades. No wonder they'd been willing to kill to protect it. As evening approached, Grace made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. She was going to finish what Martha had started, even if it meant risking everything. She owed it to her birth mother, to her adoptive father, and possibly to David and Sarah, but most of all, she owed it to the dozens of families who had been destroyed by the greed and violence of Cedar Falls' most respected citizens. Grace looked out her kitchen window toward the mountains where Martha's cabin lay hidden among the pines. Tomorrow, she would return there to study the rest of the evidence. But tonight, she would begin planning her approach to Dr. Reed. The first step in what might be her final investigation. Samson watched her from the pasture. his wise eyes seeming to understand the weight of the decision she'd made. For 15 years, Grace had hidden from the world, nursing her grief in solitude. But Martha's daughter couldn't afford to hide anymore. Too many people had died for the truth to remain buried. 3 days later, Grace returned to Martha's cabin with a backpack full of supplies and a determination to uncover every secret the place held. Samson led the way along the now familiar path, his gait steady and sure. The recent snow had melted enough to reveal details Grace had missed during the storm. Old tire tracks leading to the cabin, a small shed hidden behind the pine trees, and what looked like a root cellar dug into the hillside. The cabin felt different in daylight, less mysterious, but somehow more sacred. Grace moved through Martha's belongings with the reverence of an archaeologist, understanding that she was handling the possessions of a woman who had died trying to protect her infant daughter. In the kitchen area, she discovered a coffee tin that rattled when she picked it up. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a small cassette recorder and several tapes labeled with dates from early 1994. Grace's hands shook as she inserted the first tape and pressed play. Martha's voice filled the cabin, warm and determined, speaking in the measured tones of someone who knew she was documenting evidence that might someday be crucial. March 15th, 1994. This is Martha Sinclair, certified public accountant, recording my investigation into irregular land transactions in Cedar Falls County. Today, I met with the Rodriguez family, who were forced to sell their property on Maple Ridge Road for 60% of its appraised value. Grace listened with growing amazement as Martha's voice laid out the same conspiracy her father had documented in his journal, but with the detailed financial expertise of a trained accountant. Martha had traced shell companies, followed money trails, and documented a pattern of corruption that reached far beyond Cedar Falls. The most devastating tape was dated April 10th, 1994, just days before Martha's disappearance. I have confirmation that the intimidation is escalating to violence. The Morrison farm fire last month was arson, designed to pressure the family into selling. 3 families have reported receiving death threats. I've also discovered that the conspiracy involves money laundering through the casino development project. Federal authorities need to be notified. But I can't trust local law enforcement beyond Sheriff Hartwell. Martha's voice became more urgent as the tape continued. I'm hiding copies of all evidence in multiple locations. If something happens to me, Tom Hartwell knows where to find them. My daughter Grace is the most important thing in my life, and I pray she'll never need to know about any of this. But if she does, I want her to understand that I fought for what was right, even when it became dangerous. Grace stopped the tape, tears streaming down her face. Her birth mother's voice, speaking her name across 30 years of silence, was almost too much to bear. Martha had known she was in danger, but had continued her investigation anyway, driven by the same sense of justice that Grace recognized in herself. The final tape contained the most explosive revelation. Martha had recorded a conversation with someone whose voice Grace didn't recognize, an older man who spoke in careful, measured tones. Mrs. Sinclair, you need to understand that this investigation of yours is causing problems for very important people. The development projects you're questioning provide jobs for hundreds of families. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. You mean sometimes progress requires murder, Martha replied, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. I mean sometimes people who can't adapt to changing times find themselves left behind. Your daughter is a beautiful child. It would be tragic if she had to grow up without her mother because of choices you're making now. The recording ended abruptly, but Grace had heard enough. Martha had been directly threatened, and the threat had specifically mentioned Grace herself. Her birth mother hadn't just died for her principles. She died protecting her daughter. Grace rewound the tape and listened to the threatening conversation again, this time focusing on the man's voice. Something about his speech patterns, the careful way he chose his words, seemed familiar. She made a mental note to play the recording for Dr. Reed if she could find a way to approach him safely. In the shed behind the cabin, Grace found more evidence of Martha's methodical approach to the investigation. A detailed timeline covered one wall, mapping out every suspicious death, every forced sale, every development project over a 20-year period. Red string connected related events, creating a web of corruption that was breathtaking in its scope. But it was what she found in the root cellar that changed everything. The cellar was accessed through a hidden trapdoor, beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's bedroom. Grace almost missed it, but Samson seemed drawn to that particular spot, pawing at the floor until she investigated. The space below was dry and carefully maintained, clearly designed as a secure hiding place inside a waterproof container. Grace found Martha's most precious secret, a wedding ring with an inscription that didn't match any of the official records she'd seen. The ring was simple but elegant, white gold with a small diamond. The inscription on the inside read, M&T Always 1989. Grace stared at the date, her mind racing. According to the official records she'd found, Martha had been unmarried when Grace was born in 1993, but this ring suggested a secret marriage in 1989. 4 years before Grace's birth, the implications were staggering. If Martha had been secretly married in 1989, then Grace might have been born within that marriage. But who was T, and why had the marriage been kept secret? Grace thought about the photograph she'd found on the first night, the easy familiarity between Martha and her father. Tom Hartwell's first initial was T. The timeline would work. Grace's adoptive mother, Ellen, had always said she couldn't have children of her own, which was why they'd never had biological children. The possibility that Tom Hartwell was not just her adoptive father, but her biological father, sent Grace's world spinning again. It would explain so much: his fierce protection of her, his investigation into Martha's death, his careful maintenance of the cabin, and evidence for nearly 30 years. Grace slipped the ring onto her finger, finding that it fit perfectly. As she did, a memory surfaced from deep in her childhood. Her father teaching her to skip stones at the lake, his large hands guiding her small ones. She'd asked him once why she had his stubborn chin, but her mother's gentle eyes. He'd smiled and said, sometimes the best parts of people find their way to where they belong. At the time, she'd thought he was talking about adoption, about how love could create family even without blood ties. But now she wondered if he'd been speaking a deeper truth, that she carried the best parts of both her parents, even when the world couldn't know the full story of her origins. Grace packed the ring carefully in her coat pocket alongside the cassette recorder and most damning pieces of evidence. Tomorrow she would find a way to approach Dr. Reed, but tonight she would return to Martha's cabin one more time, to the place where her birth mother had made her final stand against the corruption that had consumed Cedar Falls. The truth was emerging piece by piece, but Grace sensed that the most dangerous revelations were still to come. Grace chose a Wednesday morning for her approach to Dr. Reed, knowing that his office would be busy enough to provide cover, but not so crowded that she couldn't speak privately with him. She drove her old pickup truck into Cedar Falls, parking 3 blocks from the medical clinic and walking the rest of the way. The waiting room was filled with the usual mix of Cedar Falls residents: elderly farmers with weathered hands, young mothers with fussy children, teenagers with sports injuries. Grace kept her head down, signing in under the name she'd used for 15 years of medical visits, acutely aware that several people were watching the mountain hermit with curious eyes. When Dr. Reed called her name, Grace followed him into his office with her heart pounding. The elderly physician looked exactly as she remembered, tall and thin, with kind blue eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, his white hair carefully combed despite his 73 years. His office was a testament to decades of practice, filled with medical books, family photographs, and certificates of appreciation from grateful patients. "Grace, it's good to see you," Dr. Reed said, settling behind his desk. "What brings you down from the mountain today? Feeling all right?" Grace had rehearsed this moment for days, but now that she was here, the words seemed inadequate. She pulled the cassette recorder from her coat pocket and placed it on his desk. "Dr. Reed, I need to ask you about my father's investigation into land fraud in Cedar Falls. I found this in Martha Sinclair's cabin." The change in Dr. Reed's expression was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the recorder. For a long moment he stared at it without speaking. "Dear God," he whispered finally, "after all these years, I thought it was buried forever. How did you—" He looked up at Grace with new understanding. "You found Martha's place. Tom always said you would when you were ready." Grace leaned forward. "Dr. Reed, I need to know the truth, all of it. Martha was my birth mother, wasn't she?" Dr. Reed closed his eyes, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years.
"Yes, child."
"Martha was your mother, and Tom was your father. I delivered you myself right here in this office on a snowy night in February 1993. It was the most beautiful and terrifying birth I ever attended." Terrifying? Because we all knew that acknowledging your existence would put you in mortal danger. Martha and Tom had been secretly married for 4 years, but they couldn't make it public. Tom was the sheriff, and Martha was getting too close to the truth about what the founding families were doing. If their enemies knew about you, you would have become a target. Grace felt the pieces clicking into place. That's why there's no record of their marriage. That's why I was raised as an adopted child. Tom and Ellen Hartwell loved you as if you were their own, but yes, the adoption was a fiction designed to protect you. Your birth was registered under Ellen's name to hide your true parentage. Only 3 people knew the truth: Tom, Martha, and myself. Dr. Reed stood and moved to a filing cabinet, removing a thick folder that looked decades old. "I've been keeping your real medical records all these years, waiting for the day when it might be safe to tell you who you really are. That day never came while Tom was alive, and after he died, I thought the secret would die with me." Grace opened the folder to find her actual birth certificate, signed by Dr. Reed and bearing Martha Sinclair and Thomas Hartwell as her parents. There were also medical records documenting her early childhood and photographs that Martha had given Dr. Reed for safekeeping. "The night you were born, Martha made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would help Tom protect you. She was already receiving threats, already afraid that her investigation would cost her everything. But she was determined to expose the corruption, even if it meant sacrificing her life." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me about the threats." Dr. Reed returned to his desk and picked up the cassette recorder. "I assume you've listened to some of these." Martha recorded everything in the final weeks, knowing that documentation might be the only way to seek justice after her death. The man threatening her on that last recording was Benjamin Cross, the current mayor's father. He's dead now, but his son has continued the family business. What about my husband and daughter? Were their deaths really an accident? Dr. Reed's face grew even more grave. Tom suspected they weren't, but he could never prove it. David was asking too many questions about the town budget, and the timing of the accident was awfully convenient. But the drunk driver was never connected to anyone in Cedar Falls, and the investigation was handled by state police. Tom spent months looking for evidence of conspiracy, but never found the smoking gun. Grace felt a cold fury building inside her. How many people have they killed? We can prove Martha's murder and suspect at least 6 others over the years. Farmers who wouldn't sell, a journalist who was investigating the casino project, a state inspector who was asking too many questions about environmental permits. They've gotten very good at making murder look like accidents. Dr. Reed opened another file and pulled out a map similar to the one Grace had found in Martha's cabin, but updated with information from the past 30 years. This is what Tom and I have been tracking since Martha's death. The conspiracy has grown beyond anything she originally uncovered. They're not just stealing land anymore. They're involved in money laundering, drug trafficking, and political corruption at the state level. The casino project Martha mentioned has become a pipeline for washing dirty money from sources we can't even identify. Grace studied the map, seeing how the original land fraud had evolved into something much more sinister. The Pinecrest Valley developments were just the foundation for a criminal empire that had infected every level of government in the region. Why didn't you ever try to expose them? With what evidence? They've had 30 years to cover their tracks, and they control the local law enforcement, the judiciary, and most of the media. Tom and I were just two old men with theories and suspicions. We needed someone younger, someone they wouldn't suspect, someone with Martha's determination and intelligence. Dr. Reed looked at Grace with an expression of hope and fear. We needed you, Grace, but we also hoped you'd never have to know about any of this. Grace felt the weight of her inheritance, not just Martha's evidence, but the responsibility to finish what her birth parents had started. The mountain hermit who had spent 15 years hiding from the world was the only person left who could seek justice for decades of murder and corruption. I found something else, Grace said, pulling Martha's wedding ring from her pocket. This was hidden in the cabin's root cellar. Dr. Reed's eyes filled with tears as he recognized the ring. I was Tom's best man at their secret wedding. It was just the four of us, Tom, Martha, myself, and my late wife Eleanor. We drove to the next county over, found a justice of the peace who would marry them without asking too many questions. Martha wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers Tom had picked that morning. Grace slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the weight of her parents' love across 30 years of separation. Dr. Reed, I need your help to finish what they started. But I need to know, can we trust anyone else in this town? The old physician considered the question carefully. There are good people in Cedar Falls, Grace, but most of them are too afraid or too compromised to help openly. The conspiracy has roots everywhere, and they've gotten very good at identifying threats before they become dangerous. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace and Dr. Reed worked together to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. They met in secret, usually at Martha's cabin, where Dr. Reed revealed that he'd been the one maintaining the property all these years, following Tom's dying instructions to keep it ready for Grace's eventual discovery. Your father made me promise that when you finally found this place, I would help you understand what it all meant, Dr. Reed explained, as they sat by the fireplace one evening. He knew that someday the truth would surface, and he wanted you to have all the tools you'd need to seek justice. Grace had been studying Martha's files with the intensity she'd once brought to lesson planning, and what she'd discovered was even worse than she'd initially suspected. The blackmail letter Dr. Reed had helped her find in Martha's hiding places revealed the true extent of the threats her birth mother had faced. The letter was typed on plain paper, but Martha had written notes in the margins that provided crucial context. The threats weren't just against Martha herself. They specifically mentioned Grace, who would have been barely a year old when the letter was written. Mrs. Sinclair, your continued interference in legitimate business operations is noted with concern. Accidents happen frequently in mountain communities, particularly to single mothers with small children. Perhaps you should consider relocating to a safer environment where curious accountants are less likely to encounter unfortunate circumstances. What made the letter even more chilling was Martha's handwritten response on the back. They know about Grace, moving her to safety tomorrow. If anything happens to me, she must never know about any of this unless she's old enough and strong enough to finish what I started. Grace realized that her birth mother had been planning to send her away when she was murdered. The secret marriage to Tom Hartwell had been Martha's way of ensuring Grace would be protected by someone with the authority and determination to keep her safe. She was going to fake her own death, Grace said, the pieces finally falling into place. Martha was planning to disappear, let everyone think she was dead, and start over somewhere far from Cedar Falls. Dr. Reed nodded grimly. But they didn't give her the chance. Someone leaked her plans, and they forced her car off the road before she could escape. The revelation led Grace to another horrifying possibility. Dr. Reed, if they knew Martha's plans, that means someone she trusted betrayed her. Someone who knew about the investigation, about her relationship with my father. About me, they spent hours going through Martha's files, looking for clues about who might have had access to her escape plans. The list was devastatingly short. Tom, Dr. Reed, and one other person Martha had trusted with her life, Deputy Daniel Cross, the young officer who had worked closely with Sheriff Hartwell, the same man who was now Sheriff Cross, continuing his family's legacy of corruption. Daniel knew everything, Dr. Reed said, his voice heavy with betrayal. Tom trusted him completely, brought him into the investigation because he needed someone younger to help with the more dangerous aspects. Martha met with Daniel several times in the weeks before her death, sharing information and coordinating their efforts. Grace stared at the photograph from Martha's wall, seeing Deputy Cross with new eyes. The young man standing next to her parents looked honest, dedicated, everything a good police officer should be. But he'd betrayed them all, feeding information to his father and the other conspirators while pretending to help with the investigation. That's how they always stayed one step ahead, Grace realized. Daniel was their inside source, telling them exactly what Tom and Martha had discovered and what they were planning to do about it. The knowledge that her father's most trusted deputy had been the architect of her mother's murder filled Grace with a cold rage unlike anything she'd ever experienced. For 30 years, Daniel Cross had walked free, had been elected sheriff, had probably ordered additional murders to protect the conspiracy his family had helped create. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Hidden in Martha's personal diary, Grace found an entry that explained why Daniel Cross had been willing to betray the investigation. February 20th, 1994, Daniel came to the cabin tonight, more upset than I've ever seen him. He says his father is threatening to destroy his career, his marriage, everything he's worked for if he continues helping Tom with the investigation. Apparently, Mayor Cross has evidence that Daniel took bribes early in his career, small amounts that seemed harmless at the time, but would destroy him if they became public. Daniel is trapped between his conscience and his survival. I told him that we could protect him, that exposing the larger conspiracy would make his smaller mistakes irrelevant. But I can see the fear in his eyes. He's going to choose his family's security over justice, and I don't know how to change his mind. Grace closed the diary, understanding the tragic irony of her mother's murder. Daniel Cross hadn't betrayed the investigation out of greed or evil. He'd been blackmailed into it by his own father, forced to choose between his career and his conscience. In the end, his weakness had cost Martha her life and condemned him to 30 years of living with that knowledge. He's been their prisoner all these years, Grace said softly, just as much a victim as anyone else. Dr. Reed looked skeptical. He made his choice, Grace. Whatever pressure he was under, he chose to save himself instead of protecting your mother. But what if he's been looking for redemption all these years? What if there's still enough of the good man in him to help us now? It was a dangerous gamble, but Grace was beginning to formulate a plan that would require inside help. The conspiracy had grown too large and too sophisticated to be exposed from the outside. They needed someone within the system, someone with access to current information and the authority to act on it. As March turned to April, Grace began laying the groundwork for what she knew would be the most dangerous phase of her investigation. She started making regular trips to town, ostensibly to visit Dr. Reed for ongoing health concerns, but actually to observe the daily routines of the people involved in the conspiracy. Mayor Benjamin Cross still held court at the diner every Thursday morning, accepting the deference of townspeople who had no idea their beloved leader was the son of a murderer. Sheriff Daniel Cross maintained his reputation as a dedicated lawman, probably wrestling with his conscience every day, but lacking the courage to act on it. Grace also discovered that the conspiracy had a new generation of participants. Benjamin Cross's son, Michael, worked as the town's development coordinator, approving the permits and zoning changes that allowed the continued expansion of the illegal enterprises. The corruption was literally hereditary, passed down from father to son like a family business, but Grace also identified potential allies. Patricia Brennan, The new county prosecutor seemed genuinely committed to justice and had no family connections to the founding families. Judge William Morrison had been asking pointed questions about some of the recent development approvals, suggesting he might be willing to listen to evidence of wrongdoing. Most importantly, Grace learned that the conspiracy was facing new pressures. Federal investigators were looking into money laundering at the casino, and environmental groups were challenging some of the more questionable development projects. The foundation of corruption that had seemed unshakable for 30 years was developing cracks. As April progressed toward the anniversary of Martha's death, Grace knew the time for planning was almost over. She had the evidence, she had identified the key players, and she had developed a strategy that might actually work. But success would require her to step out of the shadows, to risk everything her parents had died to protect. The mountain hermit was about to become Martha Sinclair's daughter, and Cedar Falls would never be the same. Grace was preparing for her final confrontation with the conspiracy when she made the discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her identity. She'd returned to Martha's cabin to gather the last pieces of evidence when she noticed something she'd missed in all her previous searches: a loose stone in the fireplace that rattled when touched behind. The stone was a small metal box, carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. Inside the box were documents that made Grace's hands shake as she read them. The first was her original birth certificate, not the one Dr. Reed had shown her, but an earlier version that bore different information. According to this document, Grace Sinclair had been born on February 15th, 1962, not 1993, as she'd believed her entire life. She was 32 years old when she'd thought she was barely one. The second document was even more shocking, a death certificate for Grace Sinclair, dated April 15, 1994, the same day Martha had disappeared. According to the official record, both mother and daughter had died in the car accident at Miller's Gorge. Grace stared at the papers, her mind reeling. If Grace Sinclair had died in 1994, then who was she? Who had she been for the past 30 years? The answer came in the third document: adoption papers for a different child, a baby girl named Emma Watson, who had been born in Cedar Falls on February 15, 1993, exactly the date Grace had always celebrated as her birthday. Emma's parents had died in a house fire when she was 6 months old, and she'd been placed in temporary foster care before being adopted by Tom and Ellen Hartwell. Grace, Emma, sank into Martha's chair as the truth overwhelmed her. She wasn't Martha Sinclair's daughter. She was Emma Watson, an orphaned child who had been given Grace Sinclair's identity to protect both her and the real Grace's legacy. But where was the real Grace Sinclair? Grace found the answer in Martha's final journal entry, hidden behind the false back of the metal box. Martha's handwriting was hurried, desperate, written in the last hours before her death. April 14th, 1994. They've found us. Daniel warned me that they know about the escape plan, that they're coming tonight. I have maybe an hour before they arrive. Grace is safe. I've hidden her with Eleanor Reed until Tom can arrange permanent protection. But they can never know she survived. The baby, Emma Watson, will become Grace Sinclair. Dr. Reed will alter the birth records, give her our daughter's identity. Emma's parents are dead. She has no one else, and she deserves a family who will love her. Tom and Ellen will raise her as their own, and the real Grace will disappear until it's safe for her to reclaim her name. My beautiful daughter is 2 years old now, old enough to remember her mother's face, but young enough to adapt to a new life. Eleanor will care for her until we can reunite, but if something happens to me, Grace must be protected above all else. The conspiracy cannot know she exists. Emma will carry our name and our hope for justice. Someday, when she's strong enough, she'll find this place and learn what really happened. By then, maybe the real Grace will be ready to emerge from hiding and help her finish what we started. Grace, Emma, read the entry 3 times before its implications fully sank in. Somewhere out there was a 30-year-old woman who was the real Grace Sinclair, Martha's actual daughter, hidden away for 3 decades while an orphaned baby took her place. The real Grace Sinclair was alive. Grace found one final document in the box, a letter addressed to Emma. When she's ready for the truth, dear Emma, if you're reading this, then you've discovered that your entire life has been built on a loving deception. You are not our biological daughter, but you have been our daughter in every way that matters. Tom and I chose you not because we needed to hide our real child, but because you needed parents who would love you unconditionally. The real Grace is being raised by people who love her just as much as we love you. She knows nothing about the conspiracy, nothing about the danger, nothing about Martha Sinclair. She has a new name, a new family, a safe life far from Cedar Falls. Someday, when the corruption is exposed and the danger is past, you and Grace will meet as sisters, united by shared love rather than shared blood. You have every right to feel betrayed by the lies we've told you. But please understand that every lie was told out of love. Every deception was designed to protect both you and Grace from people who would not hesitate to murder children to protect their secrets. You are Emma Watson, daughter of Michael and Sarah Watson, who died heroes trying to save their neighbors from a house fire. You are also Grace Sinclair, inheritor of Martha's courage and Tom's sense of justice. You are both and neither, and you are perfect exactly as you are. If you choose to seek justice for Martha's murder, know that you do so not just for a woman you never met, but for all the families destroyed by this conspiracy. If you choose to walk away, to return to your quiet life on the mountain, that is also a valid choice. You owe nothing to the dead except to live your life with integrity. But if you do choose to fight, know that you are not alone. Grace is out there, and when the time is right, she will stand with you. Together you are more powerful than any conspiracy, stronger than any corruption. With all our love, Martha and Tom Grace set the letter down with trembling hands. Her entire identity had been a carefully constructed fiction, designed to protect 2 different children from a truth too dangerous to bear. She wasn't the child of murdered parents seeking justice for their deaths. She was an orphaned girl who had inherited someone else's mission. But as she sat in Martha's cabin, surrounded by evidence of corruption and murder, Grace realized that the truth of her origins didn't change her commitment to justice. Whether she was Grace Sinclair or Emma Watson, whether she was the daughter of murdered investigators or orphaned victims of an unrelated tragedy, the conspiracy still needed to be exposed. More than that, she now had a sister, a real sister who shared her adopted name and her inherited mission. The real Grace Sinclair was out there somewhere, living a safe life under an assumed identity. Unaware that her birth mother's killer was still free, Grace thought about the past months, about how Samson had led her to this cabin with such determination. The old donkey hadn't been following some mystical connection to Martha. He'd been following Emma's need to understand her true purpose. Tom Hartwell had trained Samson to lead Emma to the cabin when she was ready, just as he'd trained him to respond to the real Grace if she ever came looking for her origins. Grace made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She was going to find her sister, bring her home to Cedar Falls, and together they would finish what Martha and Tom had started. The conspiracy had stolen 30 years from the real Grace Sinclair, hidden her away from her heritage and her birthright. It was time to give both back to her. But first, Grace needed to survive her confrontation with the people who had murdered Martha. Armed with the complete truth about her identity and her sister's existence, she finally understood the full scope of what she was fighting for. She wasn't just seeking justice for 2 people who had died before she could know them. She was fighting for the right of both Grace Sinclair and Emma Watson to live their lives in truth rather than in the shadows of someone else's. Crimes, the mountain hermit and the hidden daughter were about to become something more powerful than either could be alone. No, they were about to become sisters united in a quest for justice that had been 30 years in the making Grace spent the next week preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous gamble of her life. She had decided to reveal her true identity publicly at the annual Cedar Falls town meeting scheduled for the last Saturday in April, exactly 30 years after Martha's murder. The symbolism was deliberate. For 3 decades, the conspiracy had held its annual meeting on the anniversary of their greatest crime, conducting the town's business, while Martha's body lay unacknowledged in an unmarked grave. This year would be different. Grace's first step was to locate her sister. Using the information from Martha's hidden documents, she traced the real Grace Sinclair through a network of foster records and adoption agencies that Dr. Reed helped her navigate. The trail led to Patricia Brennan, not the county prosecutor as Grace had initially thought, but her younger sister who worked as a social worker 300 miles away in the state capital. The revelation was stunning. Patricia Brennan had been living in Cedar Falls for 2 years, had been investigating some of the same irregularities that had gotten Martha killed, and had no idea she was the daughter of the murdered woman whose case she was building. The conspiracy had hidden Grace Sinclair in plain sight, allowing her to grow up and return to pursue justice under her assumed name. Grace made contact through Dr. Reed, who arranged a meeting at a coffee shop halfway between Cedar Falls and the capital. When Patricia walked into the cafe, Grace's breath caught. The resemblance to Martha was unmistakable. The same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. "Patricia," Grace said, standing as the younger woman approached her table. "You must be Emma," Patricia replied, settling into the opposite chair. "Dr. Reed said you had information about some old cases I've been investigating." Grace had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but faced with her sister's trusting expression, the words seemed inadequate. "Patricia, what I'm about to tell you will change your life completely. I need you to listen to everything before you react." Over the next 2 hours, Grace laid out the entire story, Martha's investigation, the conspiracy, the murders, and the revelation of their shared identity. She showed Patricia the documents, played Martha's recordings, and watched her sister's world reshape itself around the truth of her origins. Patricia's reaction was remarkable. Instead of disbelief or anger, she showed the same methodical intelligence that had driven Martha's investigation. "It explains so much," Patricia said finally. "I've always felt drawn to these cases. Always felt like there was something personal at stake. I thought it was just my sense of justice, but it was something deeper. Are you willing to help me expose them?" Grace asked. Patricia's smile was pure Martha Sinclair. "I've been gathering evidence for 2 years, thinking I was building a case against political corruption. Now I understand I've been building a case for our mother's murder. Of course I'll help you." Together, they spent the following days coordinating their evidence with Dr. Reed's records and planning their public revelation. Patricia's legal expertise was invaluable in organizing the evidence in a way that would be compelling to prosecutors and judges. Grace's intimate knowledge of the players and their relationships helped identify the strongest points of attack. They decided on a 3-pronged approach. Patricia would present the legal evidence of financial crimes and conspiracy. Grace would reveal the personal story of Martha's murder and the cover-up. Dr. Reed would provide medical testimony about the suspicious and deaths over the years. But they needed one more element to make their case unassailable. They needed someone from inside the conspiracy to corroborate their allegations. Grace made the most dangerous decision of her life. She chose to approach Sheriff Daniel Cross directly, betting that 30 years of guilt had weakened his loyalty to the people who had blackmailed him into betraying Martha. She found him alone in his office on a Thursday evening, working late as he'd done for decades. When she walked through his door unannounced, his face went pale. "Grace Hartwell," he said, his voice barely steady. "What brings you to town?" "I think you know," Grace replied, placing a photograph on his desk. The picture of Martha, Tom, Daniel, and another deputy from 1993. "I found Martha's cabin. I found all the evidence. I know what you did. Daniel stared at the photograph for a long moment, his hands shaking. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "I've been waiting for this day for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've dreaded it and hoped for it in equal measure." "Tell me why," Grace said, sitting across from him. "Help me understand how a good man becomes complicit in murder." Daniel's story poured out like a confession that had been building for decades. The bribes his father had forced him to take as a young deputy, the blackmail that had trapped him when he tried to do the right thing, the terrible choice between his own destruction and Martha's safety. "I never meant for her to die," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I thought if I told them about her plans, they would just scare her away, force her to leave town. I didn't know they intended to kill her." "But you suspected," Grace said. "Yes, God help me, I suspected. And I chose my own survival over her life." Grace felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at his betrayal, pity for his decades of guilt, and recognition that he was as much a victim of the conspiracy as anyone else. "You can't undo what you did," she said finally. "But you can help me finish what she started." Daniel looked up with something approaching hope. "How?" Grace outlined her plan for the town meeting, the evidence she and Patricia had compiled, and the role she needed him to play. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a long time. "They'll destroy me," he said finally. "My career, my family, everything I've built will be gone." "Yes," Grace said simply. "But you'll finally be free." Daniel made his decision with the weight of 30 years of guilt behind it. "What do you need me to do?" Over the weekend, Grace and Patricia made their final preparations. They created multiple copies of all evidence, sending packages to federal investigators, state prosecutors, and newspaper editors. They arranged for Dr. Reed to have backup medical records in case anything happened to him. Most importantly, they prepared themselves emotionally for the confrontation that would either bring justice or destroy them all. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with spring snow dusting the mountains around Cedar Falls. Grace stood at her kitchen window, watching Samson in the pasture, and felt a profound sense of completion. Whether she survived the day or not, she had honored the legacy of both Emma Watson and Grace Sinclair. She had found her sister exposed the truth, and given Martha's investigation the ending it deserved. Patricia arrived at the farm at noon, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing an expression of determined calm. Together, they drove into Cedar Falls for the town meeting that would determine the future of everyone involved in the 30-year conspiracy. As they walked into the community center where the meeting was being held, Grace felt the eyes of the entire town upon them. Some people recognized her as the strange mountain hermit who rarely came to town. Others were curious about the professional-looking woman beside her. None of them suspected that they were about to witness the exposure of the biggest scandal in Cedar Falls' history. Mayor Benjamin Cross called the meeting to order at exactly 2 o'clock, just as he had every year for the past decade. Sheriff Daniel Cross sat in his usual spot in the front row, his face pale but determined. Dr. Reed had positioned himself near the back exit, ready to provide medical assistance if the revelations proved too much for some of the elderly attendees. Grace and Patricia took seats in the middle of the room, surrounded by the descendants of the people who had built their fortunes on blood and deception. In a few minutes, the careful facade of respectability that had protected the conspiracy for 30 years would crumble forever. Grace reached into her coat pocket and touched Martha's wedding ring, drawing strength from the connection to the woman who had died seeking the same justice. Today, Martha Sinclair would finally have her day in court, and her daughters would speak for all the victims who had been silenced by greed and violence. The final confrontation was about to begin. Mayor Benjamin Cross was halfway through his annual presentation about Cedar Falls' economic growth when Grace stood up. The room fell silent as every head turned toward the mountain hermit who had never spoken at a public meeting in living memory. "Mr. Mayor," Grace said, her voice carrying clearly through the community center, "before you continue celebrating the town's prosperity, I think the citizens of Cedar Falls deserve to know how that prosperity was built. Benjamin Cross's confident smile faltered. Ms. Hartwell, if you have concerns about municipal policy, there will be time for public comment at the end of the meeting. This can't wait, Grace replied, moving into the center aisle. What I have to say concerns crimes that have been hidden for 30 years, and everyone in this room deserves to hear the truth. Patricia stood as well, her legal training evident in her professional demeanor. Mayor Cross, I am Patricia Brennan, Assistant County Prosecutor. Ms. Hartwell is here today as a witness in an ongoing criminal investigation. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Nervous whispers rippled through the crowd as people began to sense that something unprecedented was happening. Grace could see the founding families in the front rows, the Crosses, the Whitakers, the Brennans, exchanging worried glances. I am not Grace Hartwell, Grace announced, her voice growing stronger with each word. My name is Emma Watson, but for 30 years I have carried the identity of Grace Sinclair, the daughter of Martha Sinclair, who was murdered in 1994 for investigating the corruption that built this town's wealth. The community center erupted in shocked murmurs. Grace waited for the noise to subside before continuing. Martha Sinclair was a certified public accountant who discovered that Cedar Falls' founding families were using intimidation, fraud, and murder to steal land from honest farmers and build their fortunes on blood money. When she got too close to the truth, they forced her car off the road at Miller's Gorge and covered up her murder for 30 years. Mayor Cross had gone pale, but he tried to maintain control. This is preposterous. Martha Sinclair died in a tragic accident. I won't allow these wild accusations. Your father killed her, Grace said, her voice cutting through his protests. Benjamin Cross Sr. threatened Martha and her infant daughter, and when threats weren't enough, he ordered her murder. Grace pulled out the original town meeting agenda from 1994, the one she'd found in Martha's files. This is the agenda from the town meeting, scheduled for April 16, 1994. Martha had planned to attend this meeting to present evidence of the land fraud conspiracy. She was murdered 2 days before she could speak. Patricia stepped forward, opening her briefcase. I have documented evidence of systematic fraud, money laundering, and racketeering spanning 3 decades. Bank records, property deeds, witness statements, and recorded conversations that prove the conspiracy alleged by Ms. Sinclair. Dr. Reed stood from his seat in the back. As the town's physician for 40 years, I can also testify to the suspicious circumstances surrounding numerous deaths that coincided with property disputes. Heart attacks, accidents, and suicides that followed a very convenient pattern for certain development projects. Sheriff Daniel Cross slowly rose from his seat, his face ashen but determined. The room fell completely silent as everyone waited to see which side their sheriff would support. It's all true, Daniel said, his voice breaking. Every word. I was there. I helped cover it up, and I've lived with that guilt for 30 years. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Several people gasped audibly, and Grace could see the shock and betrayal on the faces of townspeople who had trusted Daniel Cross to protect them. I was young and stupid and scared, Daniel continued. My father threatened to destroy my career if I didn't cooperate. When Martha planned to expose the conspiracy, I told them about her plans, thinking they would just scare her away. I never imagined they would kill her. Benjamin Cross jumped to his feet. Daniel, you're obviously having some kind of breakdown. Sit down, Ben, Daniel said with quiet authority. It's over. It's been over for 30 years, and I'm tired of carrying your family's secrets. Patricia held up a cassette recorder. I have Martha Sinclair's recorded testimony, including her final conversation with Benjamin Cross Sr., where he directly threatened her and her daughter. Would you like to hear your father's voice ordering the murder of a woman whose only crime was seeking justice? The mayor looked around the room desperately, seeing his support crumbling as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. Several town council members were backing away from him, and the crowd was beginning to turn hostile. This is a witch hunt, Benjamin Cross declared. Lies and fabrications designed to destroy our community's reputation. Martha Sinclair was an unstable woman who made wild accusations without proof. Grace stepped closer to the mayor, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months mastering every detail of the case. "Then explain this," she said, holding up the wedding ring she'd found in Martha's cabin. "This is Martha Sinclair's wedding ring, inscribed with her marriage to Sheriff Tom Hartwell in 1989. Explain why the woman you're calling unstable was secretly married to the most respected lawman in the county." The revelation sent another shockwave through the crowd. Grace could see people putting together the implications. If Martha had been married to Sheriff Hartwell, then her investigation had been backed by the full authority of the law. Tom Hartwell spent the last months of his life gathering evidence against your family, Grace continued. He died of a heart attack that was remarkably convenient timing, just as he was preparing to turn over his investigation to federal authorities. Patricia stepped forward again. "Federal investigators are already reviewing this case. Arrest warrants have been prepared for multiple individuals, and asset seizure orders are being executed as we speak. The Cedar Falls Casino, Pinecrest Valley Developments, and associated properties are all under federal investigation for money laundering and racketeering." Grace could see the fight going out of Benjamin Cross as he realized the scope of what they had prepared. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a carefully orchestrated legal operation designed to dismantle the entire conspiracy. As the full weight of the revelation settled over the room, Grace could see the conspiracy's power structure crumbling in real time. Council members, who had seemed untouchable just minutes earlier, were now looking at each other with suspicion and fear. Benjamin Cross made one final desperate attempt to regain control. Even if these allegations were true, they concern events from 30 years ago. Ancient history that has no bearing on ancient history. Grace interrupted, pulling out a folder of recent documents. "The money laundering through the casino happened last month. The environmental permits you falsified for the Brennan Heights expansion were signed last week. This conspiracy didn't end with Martha's murder. It evolved and expanded." Patricia stepped forward with another set of documents. "We have evidence of ongoing criminal activity, including the suspicious death of State Environmental Inspector Robert Hayes last fall. Mr. Hayes was investigating illegal dumping in the watershed when he suffered his fatal hiking accident." A woman in the crowd gasped. "Bobby Hayes was my nephew. They said he fell in the gorge because he was hiking alone." "He was pushed," Dr. Reed said grimly. "The injury patterns weren't consistent with a fall. I filed a report with the state medical examiner, but it was mysteriously lost in processing." Grace watched as the reality hit the townspeople. The conspiracy wasn't ancient history. It was an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been claiming victims right up to the present day. "How many others?" asked an elderly farmer in the back row. "How many of our neighbors died because they stood in your way?" Patricia consulted her files. "We've documented at least 12 suspicious deaths over the past 30 years. All people who either refused to sell their property or asked too many questions about development projects." The crowd's mood was turning increasingly hostile. Grace could see anger building in faces that had moments before shown only confusion. These weren't abstract historical crimes. They were personal betrayals that had affected everyone in the room. Sheriff Daniel Cross stood again, his voice stronger now that the truth was finally emerging. "I'll be submitting my resignation immediately and cooperating fully with federal investigators. I've lived with this guilt for 30 years, and I won't let it continue for another day." "Daniel, don't be a fool," Benjamin Cross hissed. "You'll destroy yourself and accomplish nothing." "I destroyed myself 30 years ago when I chose cowardice over courage," Daniel replied. "At least now I can help rebuild what we tore down." Grace pulled out the final piece of evidence she'd been saving. Benjamin Cross Sr.'s deathbed confession letter that she'd found in Martha's files. She handed it to Patricia, who read the opening lines aloud. "To whoever finds this letter, I, Benjamin Cross Sr., former mayor of Cedar Falls, confessed to ordering the murder of Martha Sinclair on April 14th, 1994. The guilt of this crime has consumed my final years, and I can no longer allow my son to carry the burden of my sins. The confession letter detailed the entire conspiracy from its origins in the 1970s through Martha's murder and beyond. Benjamin Cross Sr. had written it during his final illness, apparently hoping to ease his conscience before death, but had hidden it rather than reveal it. Benjamin Cross Jr. collapsed into his chair as his father's words condemned him from beyond the grave. The letter not only confessed to Martha's murder, but implicated him in the ongoing conspiracy and several subsequent crimes. "It's over, Ben," Sheriff Cross said quietly. "Your father's confession, combined with all the other evidence, is enough to convict everyone involved." Grace looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors, people she'd avoided for 15 years, people who had whispered about the strange mountain hermit without knowing her story. Now they knew the truth, and she could see understanding replacing judgment in their expressions. "I need you all to understand something," Grace said, addressing the entire room. "For 30 years, I lived as a hermit because I was afraid to trust anyone. I thought I was protecting myself from more pain. But isolation isn't protection, it's just another form of prison." She turned to face Benjamin Cross directly. "Your family built their power on fear, on making people afraid to speak up, afraid to trust each other, afraid to demand justice. That ends today." Federal agents began entering the community center, moving with practiced efficiency to arrest the conspirators. Grace watched as Benjamin Cross was read his rights, his empire crumbling around him. Other conspirators in the room were also being arrested. Development Coordinator Michael Cross, several council members, and business leaders who had profited from the decades of corruption. As the arrests proceeded, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Patricia, her sister, the real Grace Sinclair, standing beside her with tears in her eyes. "We did it," Patricia said quietly. "We finished what our mother started." "Our mothers," Grace corrected gently. "Martha gave me her mission, but Emma Watson's parents died as heroes too. They deserve to be remembered." Dr. Reed approached them, his face showing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "Tom and Martha would be so proud of both of you. You've given justice to so many families who never thought they'd see it." Grace looked around the community center one more time, seeing her neighbors in a new light. They weren't the enemies she'd imagined during her years of isolation. They were victims too, people who had lived under the shadow of corruption without understanding its true scope. For the first time in 15 years, Grace felt like she truly belonged in Cedar Falls, not as the strange hermit hiding from the world, but as Emma Watson and Grace Sinclair, two women who had found their purpose in seeking justice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. 6 months after the town meeting that changed everything, Grace stood in the Cedar Falls cemetery on a crisp October morning, placing fresh wildflowers on a newly installed headstone. The marker was simple but dignified. Martha Sinclair, beloved mother, seeker of truth, 1959-1994. Patricia joined her at the grave, carrying her own bouquet of autumn flowers. The two women had grown close over the months of trials and testimony, discovering that their shared mission had forged a sisterhood stronger than blood. "The final sentencing is tomorrow," Patricia said, settling the flowers beside Grace's arrangement. "Benjamin Cross will serve 25 to life, and the others receive sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years. Grace nodded, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the victims or undo 30 years of suffering. And the restitution fund. The federal government has seized over $200 million in assets. It'll take years to sort out all the claims, but the families who lost their land will receive compensation. Some of them will get their properties back entirely." Grace smiled at that news. The Henderson farm, where 3 generations had raised cattle before being forced out by intimidation, would return to the family. Old Jim Henderson's grandson was already making plans to restore the operation his grandfather had been murdered for refusing to abandon. Dr. Reed approached them. moving carefully with the assistance of a walking cane. At 74, the stress of the investigation and trial had taken its toll, but his spirit remained strong. The memorial service was beautiful, he said, referring to the ceremony the town had held the previous week to honor all the victims of the conspiracy. I think Martha would have been proud to see how the community came together, Grace agreed. The memorial had drawn hundreds of people, not just from Cedar Falls, but from throughout the region. Families who had lost loved ones, farmers who had been forced from their land, and ordinary citizens who had suffered under the weight of corruption had all gathered to remember and to celebrate the end of the conspiracy's reign. Any word from Daniel? Grace asked. Dr. Reed's expression grew thoughtful. He's doing well at the federal facility. His cooperation earned him a reduced sentence, and he's been working with other departments to identify similar corruption in neighboring counties. I think he's finally found some peace. Grace had mixed feelings about Daniel Cross. His betrayal had cost Martha her life, but his courage in finally telling the truth had been crucial to exposing the conspiracy. She'd visited him once in prison, not to forgive or condemn, but to understand. They'd talked for hours about guilt, redemption, and the weight of carrying secrets that destroy the soul. Patricia checked her watch. I should get going. The new prosecutor wants to review the cases we're bringing in the next county over. Grace hugged her sister goodbye, still marveling at how their partnership had developed. Patricia had taken a position with the State Attorney General's office, specializing in investigating political corruption. Grace had been offered a similar role, but had chosen a different path. After Patricia left, Grace walked through downtown Cedar Falls, observing the changes that had transformed the town over the past 6 months. Several of the businesses that had been fronts for money laundering had closed, but new enterprises were opening in their place. The casino had been shut down pending federal investigation, but legitimate tourism was beginning to develop around the area's natural beauty. Grace's destination was the Cedar Falls Public Library, where she now worked as the head librarian. It was a position that felt like coming home, combining her love of learning with her commitment to serving the community. She'd started a local history project, documenting the true story of Cedar Falls' past and ensuring that future generations would know about both the corruption and the courage it had taken to expose it. The library had become a gathering place for people, working to rebuild their community's identity. Grace had established a support group for families affected by the conspiracy, and she'd begun teaching citizenship classes for people who wanted to become more engaged in local government. As she unlocked the library doors, Grace reflected on how much her life had changed. The hermit who had hidden from the world for 15 years had become someone people sought out for guidance and support. She discovered that isolation hadn't protected her. It had simply postponed the moment when she would have to choose between fear and courage. Samson was waiting for her in the small pasture behind the library building. Grace had moved him to town when she took the job, unable to bear the thought of leaving her old friend alone on the mountain. The donkey had adapted well to town life, becoming something of a mascot for the community's renewal. "Hello, old friend," Grace said, scratching behind his ears. "Ready for another day of helping people find what they're looking for?" Samson had proven remarkably good at working with children, standing patiently while young readers practiced their skills aloud. Grace suspected he understood more than anyone realized about the importance of stories, having played such a crucial role in revealing the most important story of all. As the morning progressed, Grace helped townspeople research their family histories, assisted students with school projects, and provided resources for the Citizens Committee that was working to reform local government. Each interaction reminded her of why she'd become a teacher all those years ago, the deep satisfaction of helping people discover truth and understanding. Around noon, a young girl approached the reference desk with a question about her grandmother's farm, which had been in the family for generations. As Grace helped her locate historical property records, She realized this was exactly the kind of research Martha had been doing when she stumbled onto the conspiracy. But this time, the research was being conducted in the open, with full community support and legal protection. The shadows that had hidden corruption for 30 years had been replaced by the bright light of transparency and accountability. Grace looked out the library window toward the mountains where Martha's cabin still stood, now preserved as a memorial and museum. Visitors came from around the state to learn about the investigation that had brought down one of the largest political corruption cases in the region's history. The cabin had become a symbol of hope, proof that truth could emerge even from the darkest secrets, that courage could overcome fear, and that justice, though delayed, was never truly denied. As evening approached, Grace prepared to close the library and return to her small apartment above the old bookstore. It was a simple life, but it was honest and purposeful in ways her mountain hermitage had never been. She was no longer hiding from the world. She was helping to rebuild it, one story at a time.